Hello, and welcome to episode 70 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Atlanta, Georgia, I'm Nick Zoutra. On this podcast, I am pleased to welcome historian of medicine and science, sex researcher, mainstream writer, and impatient advocate, Dr. Alice Dreger. As an award-winning scholar and writer, Alice's most notable work is Galileo's Middle Finger, Heretics, Activists, and the Search for Justice in Science, which argues that the pursuit of evidence is the most important ethical imperative of our time. Funded by a Guggenheim Fellowship and published by Penguin Press, the book has been praised in many reviews, including The New Yorker, Nature, Science, Forbes, New York Magazine, and Salon. Besides functioning as an historian and writer, in the medical world, Dreger has served as a patient advocate and consultant to pediatric specialists undertaking clinical reform, particularly in the treatment of children born with norm-challenging body types, including intersex, conjoined twinning, facial anomalies, and short stature. Former chair of the Intersex Society of North America, she also served as an ethics consultant to an NIH-funded translational research network on pediatric intersex care and co-edited a medical education guide on LGBT and differences of sex development for the Association of American Medical Colleges. Alice has embodied the idea of the public intellectual, simultaneously publishing widely cited major original work in scholarly journals and in high-visibility essays in the mainstream press, including in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Wired, Slate, The Atlantic, Pacific Standard, Aeon Magazine, The Chronicle of Higher Education, New Statesman, The Los Angeles Times, and The Chicago Tribune. But lately, her most frequent byline is in the East Lansing Info, a local news organization she founded to try to rescue local news in her city and in America more generally. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Alice. Dr. Alice Dreger, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Tuesday morning?
Good. Thanks for having me, Nick. I'm in Chicago today, and it's snowing, and it's April, so I'm not thrilled about that. But.
Oh boy! Oh fun! Springtime in Chicago. It's forever winter. Great. Springtime. What are you doing up in Chicago?
We have a place. We live mainly in East Lansing, Michigan, but we also have a place in Hyde Park, Chicago that is jokingly called our lake house. Everybody else in Michigan has a lake place up north, and I said I'm an urban person. I don't want a lake place up north. I want to be in the city. So our son goes to University of Chicago now, and I fell in love with Hyde Park, and we bought a little condo there as a sort of escape pod, as we call it.
It's beautiful. Hyde Park is a really lovely place. I don't know if it quite qualifies as a lake house, but I love that concept, and especially you could have the best of both worlds. So I'm really glad to hear.
Well, our little apartment is 4 blocks from the lake, from Promontory Point, and you can swim off the rocks at Promontory Point. So right after we closed on it, I went swimming.
You're right into having fun, right into enjoying it. That's really great to hear. Okay, and so traveling back and forth between East Lansing, what have things been like for you this past year? What have you been up to professionally?
Well, I run a newspaper sort of by accident for the people of East Lansing called East Lansing Info, which is at eastlansinginfo.news. And that organization has been successful enough that it's sucking up a lot of my time. I really enjoy it, and the people I work with are great. They're largely academics, actually, who have either doing part-time citizen journalism or repurposing themselves as journalists. And that's been a great experience. So that's been taking up a lot of my time because dealing with a college town during a pandemic is extremely challenging in terms of reporting the news. We've had the shutdown at Michigan State, which has dramatically impacted the finances and the culture of East Lansing. So we've spent a lot of time working on that. And then we're also undergoing in East Lansing the whole racial awakening and dealing with our own police issues. So we've had a lot of our energies devoted to that kind of reporting too lately.
Fascinating. So what motivated you to get involved with the East Lansing Info News?
Well, I actually founded it.
Oh, wow.
So,
Okay.
I was a classic NIMBY, not in my backyard, and development project was showing up down the street from me, and I got involved with my neighborhood president, who ultimately became the managing editor of the newspaper.
Yeah.
And mostly I was concerned that we had no local news in East Lansing, as is true for much of America today. And it was very concerning to me because in East Lansing, it's a very blue town politically. Basically, as long as you wave the Union flag and wrap yourself in the rainbow, you could get elected. But then that didn't necessarily mean that things were going well at our city council. We had a huge pension debt. We had a lot of problematic issues with infrastructure problems. So I started paying attention to city council, and I already had the skills of doing journalism because I had moved from doing traditional history to doing investigative history, which moved me into doing journalism nationally. So it wasn't difficult for me to set up an organization, but it was designed as a citizen journalism non-economic model. And then I transferred it over in 2014 to become a 501c3 nonprofit as a citizen journalism organization. We have very high standards. We have traditional journalistic standards, but we are run by a board of directors. And we run at about $175,000 a year. We have 2 full-time employees, and everybody else gets paid piecework. And we bring East Lansing the news. I mean, we are like a very old-fashioned, high-quality news organization, and the people of East Lansing really appreciate us.
What have you seen to be the most positive consequences from bringing back local journalism, local investigative journalism, to a place like East Lansing, as opposed to having it covered by a major news publication in the other part of Michigan?
So the best effect is the fact that we have news. We know now what's going on at City Council, at Planning Commission, at our school board. We did not know any of that before. It was very difficult for people to keep track of that stuff. But we've seen voter turnout go up. We've seen far higher engagement by citizens in the process. We know that because they name our work all the time. But then in addition to that, because we do a model that is not a traditional news model, we do traditional news work, but the model we use is not traditional. We engage everybody we can in the community. So we have advisory boards, and we have a summer youth journalism program, and we have people who volunteer as editors and photographers and reporters. And we constantly take comments from the readers and have editorial discussions about them. So what I tell people that we're doing is really an epistemological project, because we're trying to engage people in the question of how do you know what you know about the news? And the most positive consequence to me is seeing lots of people waking up to being media literate at the national level. So we have young people all the way up to older people doing what I call grassroots media literacy at the dining room table. So grandparents and stay-at-home parents and academics working part-time or full-time working with us as well, high school students, they're all talking at home about what they're doing with us. And the consequence of that is a really positive feedback loop, talking about how do we know what we know democratically. So at my website, my own personal website, I say that what ties my projects together is that I'm interested in the epistemologies of democracy. So to me, this project is very much in keeping with what I've done before, which is the question of how do we think about what we know and what do we do with that knowledge in terms of taking care of each other.
And so do you see it as in terms of how do we know what we know in relation to understanding the news and democracy? Do you find that at this time there's been a more pressing need for this, as opposed to perhaps in years past, or is this just something that has come to be of your interest?
When I founded ELI, which is what we call East Lansing Info, I could already see the news desert forming in my own town. And part of the reason I decided to do what I did was that I was doing work nationally. So I started when I was in graduate school, my dissertation was on the history of hermaphroditism, and that led me into the intersex rights movement. And I became one of the leaders in the intersex rights movement. One of the ways you do positive social change is you work with the media. And so starting in the mid-1990s, I started having a big relationship with national media. So, what we used to call Rolodex, my contact list included people from all the major news organizations, and I would call them to try to keep this issue of intersex rights in the press. And, I did a lot of op-ed writing for the New York Times and the Washington Post and places like that. Well, as time went on, I could see that those people in science and medicine journalism were disappearing. And investigative journalism in general was being defunded. And the consequence of that was very bad for our program, which was to try to change the cultural understanding of sex and also try to change the medical treatment of intersex. And so I started having to do more and more journalism myself to bring it forward in terms of getting the activist work done. As that occurred, I could also see at home in East Lansing that we were just completely lacking any kind of meaningful news. We have it a little bit in terms of the state news, which is the Michigan State Journalism newspaper, but it was weak or strong depending on who happened to be editor that year. The Lansing State Journal, which is a USA Today paper, mostly ignored East Lansing because we don't have a lot of sexy news. We don't have a lot of murders. We don't have a lot of political scandals. We just have horrible debt and broken roads. And so we sort of moved into that direction of trying to fill that gap.
Okay, no, thank you. I really appreciate hearing that. I'd be interested to see, and I don't know if it's the case of is East Lansing is special in this regard, or is this kind of happening in perhaps a number of other college towns or other small towns where just local investigative journalism is just going by the wayside of big national media presences?
Well, it's been a sort of topic of interest nationally. So Margaret Sullivan, who is the chief media critic for the Washington Post, recently did a book called Ghosting the News, which is about the disappearance of local news in America. And she actually featured our model as one of the sort of revolutionary models. And I've certainly heard from other people around the country who have set up organizations like ours to get my advice about what they should do or not do in terms of setting things up. It's not just college towns that can do this, but I mean, just as an example, Ann Arbor, Michigan has no daily news. And so people in Ann Arbor contact me all the time and say, why can't we have an Eli in Ann Arbor? And I tell them you can, but you have to do the work and you have to be willing to be paid very, very little in order to bring the news. It's a public service project.
Yeah, you're not the ad revenue, I imagine, is not substantial in East Lansing. So it's,
Well, we don't do advertising because we're a nonprofit, and we found that trying to do conventional advertising would never support us. So we're supported by reader donation dollars, basically. And every year we do a big fundraising campaign, and we push and shove and get money from folks. We do have some local corporate sponsorships that help with various reporting, but for the most part, it's just people donating to our organization. And I will tell you that the secret sauce we've discovered is PhDs in history make awesome citizen journalists because they basically have the skills, right? They know how to think about who, what, when, where, and why. Yep. They know how to tell a story. They know how to think about sourcing. It's amazing. So my managing editor is a PhD in Russian history. And, I'm a PhD in history and philosophy of science. So we discovered that's the secret sauce is PhDs in history. And actually, one of my government reporters is just finishing her PhD at Michigan State in history also.
I'll have to tell all the PhDs in history that I know to consider something in investigative journalism potentially as a side career or as a future career. I mean, there's just not a lot of
I think the other thing is historians, they're not afraid of bringing stuff that's uncomfortable because our general feeling is like, well, that's what life is, right? And also they don't give in to the sort of simple good and evil characters. And so they're very good at maintaining a kind of appropriate approach to a topic as they bring the news.
Okay. Well, thank you for filling us in on kind of what's going on. I'm very interested, though, to hear the story of how you translated from historian, philosopher of science to getting into more of a historian, public intellectual. So let's take a step back very quickly and tell us a little bit about yourself, Alice. So where did you grow up?
I grew up on Long Island.
Oh, okay.
In a town called East Northport, which was actually south of Northport, but I think you couldn't call it South Northport, so they called it East Northport. Yep. And I grew up, between the Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean, and that's part of why I love having a place near a giant lake, because I really love being near open water. So I was a high-achieving high school student and was doing stuff, classes at the SUNY, State University of New York, down the road and all of that. And I went to Georgetown University for a year and then dropped out and became a mortgage broker for 5 years because I was really, really tired of conventional education, totally burned out. So I didn't leave to become a mortgage broker. I left and then got a job as a mortgage broker so that I could move out of my parents' house and have my own life. So at 19, I became independent and became a mortgage broker. And I did that for 5 years. And I finished my degree at the SUNY down the street, which was SUNY Old Westbury, with the intention of probably going on to law school to maybe do real estate law. But I started taking a class with actually another alum from the History and Philosophy of Science department at Indiana University, James Yana, who was a faculty member at Old Westbury, and I loved the classes. I had always been interested in both the humanities and the sciences, and I wanted to do something between science and writing. When I was a student at Georgetown University, I was double majoring in biology and English with a thought of sort of combining those two things because I really loved writing. And so as I was graduating from Old Westbury, one of my other classmates ended up getting a admission to the program in History and Philosophy of Science at Indiana University, and she had a fellowship. And so I asked Jim, what's a fellowship? And he said, they pay you to read. And I said, oh my God, that sounds really good. So I had just finished years of therapy, and my therapist said, you're cured, get out of New York. Everybody here is driving you crazy. And Jim said, it's really late, but I think we can get you into the program, because this was April. And
that's right around that time. Yeah.
Looking to start in September. Right? So you can't apply these days that late. But I sent in an application, and then I didn't hear from them. And I called a few weeks later, and I said, if I'm coming, I've got to change my whole life. So I need to know, am I in or am I out? And they said, you're in, but what's your address? And I thought that was really strange, because I thought, well, my address was on the application, right? This is when applications were done on paper. So I found out years later that they lost my application and that I was admitted out of embarrassment. The department will deny this, but I know it to be true, because the secretaries in the department and I were friends, and they told me this after a couple of years, and we all had a good laugh. And they told me it because they had found the application on somebody's desk. And they did not tell me who, but I knew who it was. And I'm not going to say who it was that lost my application, because I'm glad they lost it. I don't think they would have admitted me. I was a mortgage broker from Long Island. I don't think they would have admitted me had they not lost the application. So I did the first year and paid my own way. I cashed in all my retirement accounts from mortgage brokering. And after a year, they decided I was worth funding. So then they funded me after that. And I went on from there to, I got a one-year postdoc filling in for, not a postdoc, a sabbatical replacement job, filling in for John Beatty at University of Minnesota. And that was a really great year. And then I got a tenure track job at Michigan State. And my spouse and I ended up moving to East Lansing at that point. And he did his residency in medicine. He had graduated from Indiana with an MD. And so he did his residency in East Lansing. And then I ended up quitting my tenured job at Michigan State after we had a child, because I could not balance the life of academia and also doing full-time activism and mainstream writing and having a kid. It was just too freaking much. And when I made the list of what I was enjoying, committee work and grading was not on that list. Let's just say that. So I quit that job, and Northwestern University's medical humanities program gave me a small part-time job, long distance in Chicago. So I started a 10-year program of commuting to Chicago to teach 1 quarter per year, which was in the winter of all things. So I taught at Northwestern's medical school in downtown Chicago for a year in a great program, the Medical Humanities and Bioethics program. And I ended up quitting that job in 2015, just after Galileo's Middle Finger was published, because my dean censored something I published, and I could not stand the irony of having written a book about academic freedom and being censored. So I quit that job. And then not long after that, my son graduated high school and became a student at University of Chicago. So I have this long-term love affair with Chicago. So that's part of why I'm really happy to have a place here.
Fantastic. No, thank you. Wow. That's quite the history. So I know. So you've touched on a few of your earlier projects, and then how that has shaped. I'm really curious of the transition between going into loving writing, studying history and philosophy of science, and then working in projects in bioethics. And so, could you trace a little bit about how your intellectual development and curiosity in terms of what you wanted to write about, what you wanted to investigate, how did that unfold?
Sure. So I never really went into bioethics in my own mind. I think I did medical humanities work. Okay. I'm identified as doing bioethics because I've certainly written papers that have been published in ethics. I've actually edited books on ethics. So I guess I should say I did do bioethics. In fact, the last book I have my name on the front is with Cambridge University Press. Yes. I get Cambridge and Oxford confused. And it was co-edited with Françoise Baylis, who's a philosopher at Dalhousie University. And it's a book called Bioethics in Action. And it's personal stories of people who have wandered into medicine trying to make it better. So I guess I should not say I don't do bioethics. I did do bioethics. Basically, so my dissertation was on the history of hermaphroditism when I was at Indiana University. And that ended up becoming a book with Harvard University Press. And when I started to publish the work as a graduate student in that, the people who were starting the nascent intersex rights movement contacted me and asked me to help with the movement. And I looked at what was going on in current day medicine, and I thought it to be so out of date and so irrational that it would be very easy to change it. And so I joined the movement thinking it would only take about 6 months to fix the problem, because I had no idea how much medicine suffers from inertia. My husband kept shaking his head at me, being like, you have no idea how stupid medicine is, because of course he was in medical school at that time. And so he was like, this is not going to be that easy, but I still think you should do it. So I ended up helping in that movement for about 20 years. And since I went into that, that's how I sort of got sucked into bioethics, because I started writing about the contemporary problems with the medical treatment of intersex. And then I started getting into other interesting questions about the treatment of children born with norm-challenging bodies. So my second book was also with Harvard University Press, and that was One of Us, Conjoined Twins in the Future of Normal, which is really a stealth disability studies book written for freshmen. And it tells stories of people born with norm-challenging bodies and what has happened to them in the medical system, and why the medical system is well-intentioned but broken in terms of how it approaches abnormality.
Could you?
And so... Yeah, so then from there, I sort of got sucked more and more into the bioethics system. It's true.
Could you describe a little bit about, you alluded to some of these major problems. For those who haven't read your books or haven't perhaps read a little bit of your work, like what would you say to be some of the major, what were the biggest issues related to these, related to medicine that prohibited a clear understanding or practice, and what, I don't know, has anything changed as a result?
The biggest problem in medicine at that time when we were starting our work, which was the mid-1990s, and this may sound very strange, but medicine did not have an orientation of being evidence-based. And so it was interested in science, there was no question, and it was influenced by bench science and pharmaceutical research and anatomy and physiology research and all of that. But it was remarkably neglectful of the question of what actually works and what actually doesn't work. So the movement for evidence-based medicine actually started in the UK, and it took a long time to reach the US. And the reason was that in the UK and in places like Canada and Germany, there is socialized medicine. And socialized medicine has to ask the question, where should we put the dollars? And it asks so in a top-down fashion. So it asks very specifically, what the hell is working? What the hell is not working? And let's not pay for what's not working. In America, you have this crazy balkanized medical insurance system. It pays very little attention to what actually works and what doesn't work, and it pays attention instead to what do people want and what do people not want and how do we make the most money. And so it's a very different kind of system. So the main challenge for us was trying to get the people treating intersex to recognize that they did not have good evidence for what they were doing. And then, in fact, we had a lot of anecdotal evidence of harm. The other problem was this phobia around sex and the belief that you have to have a two-sex system, the confusion of gender with sex. So the assumption that you could not have, for example, a girl with a large clitoris because that would screw up her gender. So the assumption was you had to cut down her clitoris. The assumption that a boy born with a small penis had to be made into a girl because no real man could grow up with a small penis. So this confusion of sex and gender, this mistaken conflation of health with normality and pathology with abnormality. They are not at all the same thing, of course. Abnormality can just be statistical. Pathology is an actual illness. So those were the challenges facing us, and they were quite substantial in terms of trying to get anywhere. The other problem was pediatrics sees itself as heroic medicine for children. And so if you question it, you're a jerk. And we were jerks because we questioned pediatricians.
That's interesting to know. That's I did not realize this. So okay. And so how was your work with intersex received?
Well, it was an interesting period of my life because certainly people in the intersex rights movement were, for the most part, glad to have my help. They're glad to have anybody's help. And there were other academics helping as well, Ann Foster Sterling and Suzanne Kessler and other folks. But as time went on, of course, within activist movements, there's always a lot of dense politics. And so there was reasonable questioning about what I was doing there since I did not have an intersex identity. And then how was it received in the medical system? Well, at first, the medical system was very happy to invite me because I had a history degree, and they think of history as safe, right? History is all about how our forefathers did such good things. That's what they understood history to be. So they would let me in the door, and then I would tell them what I really thought about what was going on. So I was useful in that way because I was a bit of a Trojan horse, and a lot of times I would actually bring an intersex person with me so they could tell their own story about what had happened. So it was a very interesting period. And then dealing with the media was very interesting because at the time, people were not as openly talking about sex. And it was a period where it was a little bit harder to get open discussions of genital issues, for example, into actual mainstream media discussions. But it was definitely a fascinating time. And I was honored to help with all of that work.
How did the work connect with the work with intersex and then conjoined twins? Were some of those, I guess, epistemological ideas related to the medical humanities connected in some way, or how did that kind of happen?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was part of a group that was funded through the Hastings Center called the Surgically Shaping Children Working Group. And that was run by Eric Perens, who did great work bringing a group of us together to talk about intersex and also short stature, including dwarfisms.
Sure.
And then we were also looking at craniofacial anomalies. And looking at those three things together was very interesting. And the book published on that is called Surgically Shaping Children. Those things were very useful for us to think about how to sort of parse out what the right thing to do for children and parents with these circumstances is what's the right thing to do. And so that was a very useful thing. I ended up doing a lot of reading and use of disability rights literature, disability studies as well. And then also feminist philosophy of science comes very much into play because feminist philosophers of science have thought a lot about issues of dependency. So to this day, my best friend is Ellen Fader, who's a philosopher at American University. She's done a lot of work on intersex and race, but also on dependency issues.
Okay. No, thank you. And so, before we get into perhaps some current and contemporary work, you alluded to perhaps your most well-known book, Galileo's Middle Finger: Heretics, Activists, and One Scholar's Search for Justice, funded by Guggenheim Fellowship. Could you take us a little bit through how this particular work came about and the story behind it?
Yeah, as I was leaving the intersex rights movement, I needed a sort of palate cleansing history to do. And being an idiot, I decided to take on a very controversial topic. So I took on this book controversy related to a book that Michael Bailey, who was a psychologist at Northwestern University, had published called The Man Who Would Be Queen. And it was a book about gender differences among biological males. And one of the things he was looking at was transgender issues. And the section on transgender issues was highly controversial. And a group of transgender activists had attacked him for that book and pretty much tried to ruin his life. I mean, it's I'm not overstating it when I say they tried to ruin his life. And so what was fascinating to me was that when the Bailey book controversy had happened, I was sort of vaguely aware of it because it involved friends of mine in sex research, but it also involved friends of mine in gender movements and intersex movements and things like that. So they seemed to have such oppositional ideas of what was true about Michael Bailey. And one of my closest friends, Paul Vasey, who's a sex researcher at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, was a good friend of Mike. And that really confused me because Paul is a gay man who's very progressive and was a good friend of mine and a good judge of character. And I thought, this is weird, right? Why would Paul like Michael Bailey? So, because I understood him to be evil incarnate. And so I met Bailey and we had this very skeptical, tense dinner that I think I recount in the book. And then I became sort of fascinated with what was going on. So I started blogging about it. And then one of the people who had attacked him came after me. And then I became more fascinated, like, why am I being attacked like this? And so I ended up taking a year of my life doing a history of what had happened in the Bailey book controversy. And I published that work. It was a 50,000-word journal article. It was published in Archives of Sexual Behavior. And it painstakingly laid out what had happened to Bailey and why he was so threatening to a particular group of transgender activists. And I showed there what I didn't expect when I set out to do this, that basically they had framed him. And after that was published, Steven Pinker, who was one of the people who was collaterally attacked, loved the piece and said, "You're a great writer, and let me introduce you to my agent, and you should do a book on this subject." And I said, "You know what? They're coming after me, and they're trying to destroy me, and I kind of need to regroup. And so would you do something different and give me a recommendation for a Guggenheim?" So I had him and Dan Savage, which was an interesting combination. The sex advice columnist, Dan Savage, and a couple other people write for me letters of recommendation to the Guggenheim, which I then got. So then I had a Guggenheim grant to do a book I was at the time calling Galileo's Ghost, and looking at the attack of progressive researchers by progressive activists. I was fascinated by this phenomenon, in part because I'd been and still was a progressive activist. So I was really interested in, I was sympathetic to both sides. So the book morphed into Galileo's Middle Finger, and it ended up becoming this sort of long journey through this question of how do we think about the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of truth and what they have to do with each other. And that's basically what the book is about, is this combination of pursuits of pursuing truth and pursuing justice, and what does it mean to try to do that in America today. And in many ways, it's sort of the prehistory, the cancel culture problem.
Yeah.
So what happened to Bailey was absolutely cancel culture. We didn't have that term at the time. But I also looked at what happened to Napoleon Chagnon, the famous anthropologist, at the hands of the American Anthropological Association. And then the end of the book returns me to intersex rights work because I was called in to try to fix some really bad, awful practices happening within intersex treatment with regard to the use of a drug on pregnant women, and also the use of clitoral stimulation studies on little girls whose clitorises have been cut down. So,
thank you. No, thank you for that. So, what I found really fascinating about this, and I've read some of the your I think quite good responses to kind of sussing out and kind of describing what's going on, or especially related to the progressive activism and progressive researchers. I think what I found interesting about historians and philosophers of science, or in particular philosophers of science, is often having to be kind of in the middle between two different camps. With philosophy or history of science, you're usually between the humanities and the sciences, and people have often used the terms like a halfie or something like that. You're never fully in something. My old advisor, Colin Allen, people would call him a halfie, or they would dismiss him. They'd call him a scientist. The philosophers would call him a scientist as a derogatory comment in the hallway. But mostly, this perhaps is, I'm not exactly sure how analogous, but what I'm trying to say is you find yourself in a place as a progressive researcher, someone very sympathetic and attuned to these other genuine concerns and feelings and issues, yet still being, attacked and or criticized, perhaps uncharitably or unfairly, or just. So I'm curious, what have you come to make a sense of navigating being in the middle? Because typically the way perhaps cancel culture likes to see things now is you have the researchers, and then you have there's just more extremes. So how do you navigate being in the middle? How do you navigate being someone that is interested in progressive research, but also interested in being understanding of those who might be concerned with the consequences of that research?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I've stepped somewhat away from that life, but I was also in the middle in terms of not really being fully in academia, being out in the mainstream, doing mainstream writing and also activism, and only being part-time in academia also put me kind of in the middle. So I would say that generally my approach was to not agree to be in anybody's party, and to sort of hold the line in the sense of not. I mean, part of me watches academics who really do have clear disciplinary lives, and I feel jealous in the same way I feel jealous of my sister, who's a conservative Roman Catholic nun, because I'm an atheist and I don't have anything like that, right? Yeah. I don't have anything that feels comforting in that way, and I don't have that disciplinary unilateral life that would feel, I think, deeply comfortable. Because we have this place in Hyde Park. I walk all the time at University of Chicago, and I see all these academics, some of whom I know who they are because they're kind of famous. And I think, sure, wow, it would be so cool if I could go back and have my life and be sort of the monk of academia that these people are, where you have a clear disciplinary life. But I was never good at that. And sure. So I think that if I started to get into anybody's camp too much, I would soon realize I don't fit there either, and it would make me very lonely all over again. So I just refuse to belong to anybody's camp. So when Barry Weiss tried to draft me into the intellectual dark web, I rejected it, and I wrote a piece for the Chronicler of Higher Education called "How I Escaped the Intellectual Dark Web," saying I don't want to be identified with this group. Right. I don't want to be identified really with any group, because I think that as soon as I'm identified with a group, I realize I don't belong there either, and it just makes me feel lonely. So for the most part, I just avoid it. Aww. The other thing that I do is I balance a lot of different projects at once, because I think it's a good form of self-therapy. Writing is what I really love, and to be honest, lately in the middle of the night, I've been writing fiction books, which has been really fun because I never used to think of art as something that held something particular for me. One of my brothers is an artist. He's a visual artist, and I drive him crazy because I don't really get visual art. I only see with one eye for complicated reasons. Both of my eyes work, but only one of them is turned on at any given time. And so I don't have depth perception. I don't see art very well. And so I never really thought of art as being meaningful to me, but I have to say that starting a few years ago when I had to quit Northwestern and ended up sort of ejected from academia by accident because of a jerk of a dean, I did find that starting to write fiction really helped me think about the problems of the world and also to understand myself better and to escape more. So that's been really fun.
Fantastic. Could you mind sharing what kind of fiction do you tend to write? You don't. I mean, if this is like a personal journal, you don't have to share. But
no,
I think that's great. Yeah.
I've blogged about the intention of having done this for years. It's a mystery series. I haven't published any of it yet, but I'm finishing writing the third book, and my friends are yelling at me to go publish it under a fake name so that nobody can attack me. Yeah, I know. But the thing is, it's been so incredibly pleasurable for me to write these things that I don't even feel like publishing them. But it's funny because the friends of mine who've been reading them for me and helping me with the books are like, "Oh my God, you should absolutely publish this. This is absolutely publishable." But I keep saying, but it feels so nice to have this private art space. And because I'm like every other middle-aged person and I wake up in the middle of the night, it's the best thing to do in the middle of the night. The whole world is quiet and I just write mystery novels and it feels amazing. And they're very much based in sort of history and philosophy of science. They're not heavy intellectual books by any means, but they explore a lot of the topics that I've come into in my own life. And they're an attempt to for myself to sort out some of those things. It's been really fun.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, that sounds like a lovely activity, as well as and not only just intellectual, but just like life, like just affirming as in a personal way. So I'm really happy to hear you're enjoying that. And if you ever do publish, I'll be happy to read under your fake name or whatever your pseudonym, whatever it is you do. So before I would love to talk about fiction books. You mentioned, so you alluded to something related to like the sort of the before kind of this idea of intellectual cancel culture has come about. And I don't want to talk too much about it, but I wanted to get your kind of take or understanding on what you see. How is perhaps as a trained historian, as a trained intellectual, how do you approach this issue or discussion of cancel culture from an informed, that nuanced perspective?
It's really difficult because I think we are in a unique historical moment. I think there's no question it feels like the 18th century witch trials where, somebody utters one thing wrong and then their life ends. And if anybody dares to try to defend that person, then they are also a witch and their life will also end. So it is a very depressing moment to me. The internet has brought us so much good, and social media has brought us so much good. I mean, the intersex rights movement could not have existed before the internet. It existed because of the internet. The conditions that we're talking about are rare enough that those people could simply never have found each other without the internet. Doctors were not going to introduce them to each other. And so the only way for them to really meaningfully find each other was random or the internet. And so much good has come of the internet, but social media has really, the corporations that run social media systems are very interested in inflaming our passions because that's what keeps us connected to their corporations. Right. And that's what allows them to sell us advertising. And then they have very much trained us to be monkeys, to either like or dislike. Those are the two categories they've given us. And when you're a person like I am, which is somebody trying to think about facts a lot, it's offensive to think about the idea of liking and disliking factual news stories or histories or these kinds of things. But this is where social media has put us, into this constant culture of like, dislike, like, dislike, like, dislike. And so they're purposely inflaming our passions and causing us to be in perpetual conflict because, frankly, it pays. And I don't know how we fix this problem, but I do know that it is emotionally exhausting, that I've met people who are suicidal or people who have, over time, later killed themselves because it is absolutely unlivable in terms of once you've been attacked, it is an unlivable situation. And in the book, Galileo's Middle Finger, one of the things that I write about is what happened to E.O. Wilson at Harvard at the hands of folks like Stephen Jay Gould. And that was really moving to me because that was, again, before the days of cancel culture. But the movement against Wilson at Harvard was very intense. There were flyers put up on trees and light poles all denouncing him as a eugenicist and all of that. And talking to him for the book, I realized that he had suffered something very similar to what I had suffered, and yet I had never realized, I'd never thought of him as a person who had been through a lot of what are frankly traumatizing experiences. I don't like to use the word trauma lightly because I think it's overused, but he clearly was somebody who had been through a lot of identity rattling, disruptive experiences that were harmful. And it was powerful to talk to him and to talk to Elizabeth Loftus and people like that. And the one thing it did help me with is to recognize that anytime you're somebody who's out in the public, you're going to be exposed to a lot of hatred. And these days I read the Tao Te Ching, the Stephen Mitchell translation a lot, and I really have to ask myself the question of how much to engage, because engagement feels futile a lot of the time.
I understand that, and I can relate, and I definitely hear you. You mentioned, you touched on a little bit about how, you having experienced some of this directly, is that even after having been a historian of a particular case and understanding the folks. I mean, how did it impact you?
Well, I talk about in the book Galileo's Middle Finger, the first time I was really super attacked, which was the transgender activists who came after me in, I think, 2006 or 7. And that was a really brutalizing experience. At the time, Google's algorithms were easier to manipulate, and these are people who are very good at computers. So they basically changed out my entire identity overnight, and it was shocking. If you Googled me 1 month versus the next month, my entire identity changed. I became an enemy of the intersex rights movement, an enemy of the transgender rights movement. Somebody who was sort of funny now, but it was painful at the time. Somebody who was a spy for the Catholic Church, essentially. They attacked my sister. They attacked my parents. They had gone after Michael Bailey's kids, and I had a kid at the time who was young, and so it really scared me that they would come after my kid. It was brutalizing. It was really, really hard, and it hasn't gotten easier since, in spite of the fact that I have a lot of calluses. It's still kind of exhausting. So a couple of years ago, I was writing for the Chronicle of Higher Education as sort of an outsider looking back at academia. And I was glad to have that writing gig. It was fun. There were good editors at the Chronicle, and it was a good thing, good experience. So they contacted me and they asked me to write a piece for a guidebook that they were doing for grad students on doing work in the archives. And I was supposed to write the introductory funny piece. And a lot of pieces I write are funny because, like a lot of comics, I've been through a lot of shit. And so comedy is how I deal with it.
Of course.
So they asked me to write a very specific piece, which was know your activist, your archivist type. And they were like, the kind of archivist who won't shut up and won't let you get your work done, and the kind of archivist who has an agenda. And so I wrote the piece, and I thought it was really funny, and they thought it was really funny. And they came back to me and they said, we have one more type, and maybe this type, but could you add it? The editorial team discussed it. Could you add this type? I was like, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. And so I wrote a funny profile of that type, and they published it. And a thing I never would have expected happened, which was a group of archivists got extremely offended that I was stereotyping archivists. and no kidding, they came after me. And they came after me brutally. And the Chronicler of Higher Education did nothing. I'm sorry, I'm getting teary thinking of this. They did nothing to help me. Nothing. They just left me hanging. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, I've been through so much. And now the archivists are coming for me. And it was like my last refuge.
I'm sorry. I'm sure. Yeah, just that's.
No, I know. It's so stupid to think about, right? But my last refuge at that point was the archives. I was going regularly to the Library of Congress to read the papers of Francis Kelsey at the FDA, who is my hero, in order to not kill myself. Right. And the archivists come after me. It was just like, wow. So I just thought, there's no freaking winning with these people. So I largely disengaged. And it killed me because the people who thought it was funny who were archivists wrote me back channel and were like, this was hilarious. What is wrong with these people?
Satire, yeah. It sounds like a satire piece.
In fact, I ended up publishing in my own space a request for retraction from the Chronicle, which they ignored. They just ignored. So, yeah. I told them as an editor, I treat people much better. But that was a very, very, very poor experience, frankly. So it's, you have to ask yourself, like, is it worth it? Is it worth it being out there? So right now I'm doing a series of new blogs for the Heterodox Academy because, geez, I mean, Heterodox Academy is all about pissing people off. I might as well write for them. It's not going to be any surprise. And they're not going to throw me under the bus if somebody gets mad at something I've written, because that's their whole gig is, not worrying about people offending other people. So...
Well, that's a really tough story to go through, and I think I imagine
it's absurd and ridiculous.
It's crazy,
right?
yeah.
I mean, the idea of archivists having pitchforks and torches is so stupid and comical. It's like something out of KCD.
And what's particularly troubling is it's like folks that you identify closely with, and it's like folks you're like, at least these people will have my back, or like at least these people can take it. Not even like it's really unfortunate, like the issues of, I don't know, like the I don't want to say not taking a joke, but just kind of misunderstanding intention. It's just a tough thing to undertake, and so I completely understand the later consequence to decide to necessarily disengage. And
so it feels simpler, right, to be doing. Now I do investigative work on municipal bonds in East Lansing. I write about problematic development projects, and I support my staff that's doing these really awesome data analyses of use of force by our police department and who gets hired and not hired by our city and by our school district. And we're bringing incredibly good research at the local level. And the only people who attack me are the people like big developers, and I can take it. I mean... Right. I'm not going to get canceled by a big developer. Them getting mad at me only increases the love of our readership. So,
well, it's interesting. So perhaps maybe you could speak to this. So as a public intellectual, I mean, it is true, and I'm sure other public intellectuals can attest that, kind of the bigger you get, and perhaps even, if you touch on even a little bit of a controversial issue, the attacks grow, and it's, I don't know. Do you feel some sort of like a new understanding for those who have been attacked, or I don't know.
Well, I think I've always had that understanding because I've been dealing with it for so long. But I will say I think the attacks are experienced differently by women than they are by men, and it's why a lot of the women just drop out of the scene, because the attacks, the threats that come with threats of rape, they come with threats of murder, they come with very different types of threats. I mean, men sometimes get that shit, but women get it a lot more, and we get the emails and we get the DMs and we get the creeps, and there's a level at which it just feels so exhausting to deal with that stuff. I've read and I've seen some of your writing describing that. It sounds atrocious. It sounds awful. It is, and it's very wearing, and I don't know what the solution is. I mean, I'm a free speech advocate, so I don't really want to say we need to just shut people down. On the other hand, the cultural system that we have really allows for that kind of stuff, and it's very disturbing. Okay. And I do think women experience it differently. I don't just think that women get a different set of responses. I think we also experience those responses differently.
Absolutely. No. I think that's really interesting to see, or to point out and describe. So so in terms of, slowly perhaps disengaging from some of these topics, but still wanting to do a lot of investigative work. What kind of work So what kind of work has been engaging you now? I mean, we touched right away at the beginning with the work with Eli in East Lansing Info. Is that kind of the main push at the moment, or what's?
Well, through that work, I've actually been working with folks nationally, sort of on the question of the rescue of local news and what that would look like. And so the next book I do, the next nonfiction book I do, I think will probably be a piece about local news in America, but it'll actually be a story about human nature. When you do local news in a small town, you realize what a lot of people really don't get, but all historians know, which is people don't break into good and evil. They're all complex characters, and most people are really well intended, but democracy is a mess. And it's why we need the press, is because, as we say, it is the first draft of history, and that first draft has to be written, or the next draft is never going to be written. And that's part of the reason, I think, why historians feel very much drawn to the news crisis, because we do very much feel like the level of records and the level of recording is being lost. Even though people are constantly posting things all the time, there's no meaningful records being kept. And that feels very unsettling to those of us who are historians. It's shocking how little history we are laying down right now in some ways.
So you'd made a pitch to have historians come on to work. I mean, how serious is this? It sounds. Given your obvious personal interest and seems like commitment. Is this something that we really could potentially need? Is a different kind of journalism, or a different the way in which you're describing these things? Is this a push for historians to get outside of their discipline and do this other kind of work?
I don't think people have to do that, but I don't think I'm any different from other people in other disciplines, where I feel like the discipline I most closely ally with is the one that would save the world, right? Surgeons set up surgical relief systems around the world, and ophthalmologists set up ophthalmological relief systems, and economists engage with economic issues around the world. And so, there's other projects I've done, like in my work doing history by accident, I ended up doing private, personalized histories for people who had been through medical traumas. And so one of the things I wanted to do for a long time was set up a foundation that would engage historians with people who had been through horrible traumas of various types, so that they could write them short personal histories. Because having a history written of what you've been through is an incredibly therapeutic thing, I learned working with people. So, there's lots of things I would love to see historians doing, but I'm not going to suggest that somehow academic historians are supposed to be the people who do everything in the world. They're busy enough.
Got things to do.
But there are many, many useful things historians who are underemployed or unemployed can be doing. The issue is that we have to set up ways to pay for that.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the time, there's some, if you can accept little pay, but doing it for like a nonprofit, it's possible, but it's challenging. I can understand. It is.
Not that academia pays very well, but
right.
For most people.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. Why don't we address some of the other one of the last questions that I tend to ask guests, and we can kind of bring it back to your training in history and philosophy of science, and then thinking about the kind of work you've done. Perhaps you could discuss with us, what do you see the greatest challenge facing historians and philosophers of science today?
Well, it's one that's been developing for a long time, which is the new economic model within academia, which assumes that everybody should basically be a salesperson and should have to have external funding that pays for their own work. There is no good grant system for funding most history and philosophy of science. There's some money out there, but not very much of it. And the consequence of that is that people are constantly driven to do projects that are the rare projects that can obtain funding, and they are often not the most interesting projects, and they're often not the projects that motivate people. So I think the greatest threat is the way that the academic system has become a corporatized, monetized branding system that expects faculty members to function essentially like car salesmen and to earn their keep every month, rather than thinking of them as intellectuals and thinking of them as teachers and as people who are doing good work in the world that might not be directly fundable and may take years at a time. So I think that's the biggest threat, is the corporatization of academia.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that thought. And that's something.
And the great irony of that is that the person I fell in love with at Indiana, who's the medical student, is now a dean of the medical school at Michigan State University. So I say that where my life is sort of funded by a university administrator to a large extent these days. And certainly my health insurance comes through a university administrator. So, the irony. But he did not mean to become an administrator. He was just tragically good at what he did.
I don't think nobody grows up to want to be a dean, but like it just kind of happens. Like I think all of us. I think
some people do want to grow up to be a dean, but he did not want to grow up to be a dean. He's just remarkably good at it. So.
Okay. Well, Alice, thank you so much for taking the time, and I really appreciate you kind of going into some of those, a little bit more touchy subjects. I appreciate you sharing.
I'm used to it. It's fine.
I think it's really important because I mean, generally this is going to continue, and I think folks are wanting to have some of the, the more we continue to do research, especially as philosophers of science. I made a little bit of connection. I don't think this quite draws to the same level, but I know we have a lot of philosophers of climate science in our department, and what happens with them is every time they give a talk, they have to qualify that they're not climate skeptics because they're working on climate models and the epistemology of like what those models can predict. But there's always this kind of tenseness about studying something like climate because in the popular media, unfortunately, there's been such attacks in general. So it's a different kind of thing. But in any way, the thought of not studying or not doing the kind of work that you yourself and others are attempting to do with the good intentions and with the ability to try to be that, I don't know, I just think it's really important. So I really appreciate the work that you've done, and I really appreciate you sharing about it and defending those. I think that's really important.
I think that's a problem too that people have faced forever, right? Is the problem of when you're doing a critical analysis, you're seen as a critic.
Right. That's just fair. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Hope things warm up in Chicago and you get to jump in that lake pretty soon. And
you too.
But yeah. All right. Take care. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. You too.